Welcome to Pause for the Truth, where you can sit back, relax, and hear an honest dialogue about health, wealth, legal, and social issues. The hosts are Dr. Rogers Kane, family practice physician, and Jocelyn Turner, health education consultant, with co hosts from the Northeast Florida Medical Society and its foundation. Stay tuned for the truth about matters affecting you and your family. We're here to tell you what's really going on and why. Good evening and welcome to Pause for the Truth. I am Jocelyn Turner, your co host for the evening. And of course, always joining me on the podcast is Dr. Rogers Kane. How are you doing this evening, Dr. Kane?
I am doing great. I am happy to be here. I am happy to have the guest that we got coming on. Should be giving a very interesting and informing conversation. I just wish we had more time.
You already know in advance, Dr. Kane, that we're going to need more time. That our guests will probably want to hang up on us and say no more, Dr. Kane and Johnson. We'll catch you all another time, but we're very excited to have what I think, and I think Dr. Kane will agree, two distinguished guests with us tonight on the podcast. Not that any other guests that we've ever had aren't distinguished, but tonight's topic is a very important one as we talk about the evolution of voting. So I just have to give my first, I'll say a disclaimer. I actually heard our one guest, Dr. Tamika Hobbs, speak the other day, and I was so intrigued by her presentation that poor thing was trying to leave, and I was just harassing her. I mean, coming behind her like a stalker, saying, Dr. Hobbs, can I talk to you? Oh, and you remember me from another meeting we were in. So very pleased to have Dr. Hobbs with us tonight. She's a historian, an author, just everything you want to know about our history. I'm putting that out for her. She didn't say that, but thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for joining us. How are you this evening?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation, Ms. Turner. Nice to meet you, Dr. Kane. And of course, great to see Ms. Spoon again with the League of Women Voters. She does some tremendous work. It's always an honor to be on with her.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, and welcome. Also joining us, as Dr. Hobbs has already said, is attorney Cecile Schoon from the League of Women Voters of Florida. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. Attorney Schoon, hopefully I said that right, and thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to meet you this evening. Welcome.
Thank you, and you said it perfectly.
Wonderful. Well, we all know that there's a lot going on in the landscape of elections nowadays. I am so amazed in the years of my life how much has seems to happen now more than ever. And I don't know, we've all heard terminology that we probably never thought we'd hear: stealing votes and voting precinct workers being threatened by just the mere fact that they did something illegal to sway the election toward one candidate than another. But I'm also reminded of, and I tell my friends, that people in my circle, that people died to give us the right to vote. And so I personally take it seriously. I recently reviewed my voting information online, and I felt I had to smile when I became a registered voter. Now I frowned in the one sense because it was a year after I graduated from college. I should have done it the year I graduated from high school, right? But nonetheless, I'm proud to say that I have tried to be consistent along the way. But I can admit, when I was a younger woman, I didn't pay attention to it as much as I do now. Attorney Schoon, I'm going to start with you a moment. There are some things on the ballot in the state of Florida that people I know said that I don't understand them. Can you please help explain to us? Let's start, and I'm talking about the amendments, as you know. Can you first explain to us, tell us about Amendment 1? And I have your handy dandy little publication in front of me, so I am cheating, and I was happy that that you all put this out. And let me just tell our audience, Amendment 1 poses limits on increased property assessment for flood improvements. Now, we know that in Florida, Hurricane Ian did a lot of destruction. So I'm not surprised that people are going to be swayed by this particular amendment, Attorney Schoon, based on what may have happened to them personally, their families. But tell us about what exactly does this amendment mean?
Okay. Well, first of all, we have an opportunity to vote on proposed amendments to our Constitution. And this one impacts our revenue that the state obtains. And so, generally speaking, the league's position is that things that impact revenue, because it oscillates and changes with the needs of the state. You know, we're doing well this year, we don't need as much taxes. Next year, business wasn't as good, we need more taxes. So we like our laws that deal with taxes and revenue to be something passed by the legislature because it's easily changed year by year. Now, so we have a general policy. We say, let's not put revenue issues in the Constitution. Those are much harder to change. You put, it sounds like, you know, Constitution, it's the foundation. And so we generally say, put your revenue issues in state legislation that can be modified year by year. This is a situation where they've decided to place it in try to get it in the Constitution. And what does it do? It says it's an acknowledgement, frankly, of the major storms that we've been having. We had Michael, which hit my community very badly. My office top was taken off. I'm in the office now. We had a lot of repairs in my home. I got a double whammy. So there were many people in our area. And so people are saying we have to help the citizens so that if the citizens rebuild their home in a way that takes into account flooding and other damages, do we want to, quote, penalize them by raising their taxes? Because the more value on your home, it's a percentage on the value of your home is the taxes. So the government is saying we want to encourage people to fix their homes so they'll survive. Because the more homes that get damaged is the more state need that has to go out, businesses shut down, and everybody is, you know, losing money. So they're saying, let's encourage the citizens by saying, go ahead and make repairs to your house, and we will not increase their taxes for that amount of repairs. So that's really what the idea of it is. So on one hand, the league's position is, hey, that's a good idea. We had Michael in 2018, we had Ian just a few weeks ago, and we see the devastation and the tragedy for the people. If we could encourage people to reinforce their homes to avoid flooding and different things like that, let's encourage them by basically giving them a tax break. So that's why the league basically is kind of torn on this one. We're not taking a position. Normally we would say, again, don't put revenue issues, tax issues in the Constitution because it sits there. On this one, we said that's our general rule of thumb. On the other hand, we're having all these weather problems. We don't want people to have their homes damaged unnecessarily. So we're going to just be quiet about this one. So the league sees both sides of it. And so we came out neutral.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Schoon. What about Amendment 2, abolish the State Constitution Revision Committee? What's the first of all, what is the State Constitution Revision Committee? And Dr. Hobbs, not to worry, we're going to get to you.
The State Constitution Revision Committee, that's something that comes every 20 years, and not every state has it. And it's specific people that are named in part by the governor and in part by their titles. Like I think the president of the Florida Bar is on it, and some Supreme Court justices and different people are appointed by the governor and the legislator. They appoint people to it. And it's quite a large group of people, a body. It's like a commission. And the league is in favor of the commission because, generally speaking, in the past, they have traveled all around the state and they've taken testimony of our citizens. We want the citizens' voice to be heard. We like it that these powerful people got to listen and answer questions of the citizens, and they travel the state. Now, this last time, there have been some times recently that because of COVID, that these kinds of hearings and things have been limited. But generally speaking, that's what the Constitution Revision Commission does. So we feel that when they get out and talk to the people, then they're hearing direct democracy desires from the people. And so usually that has an influence on the recommendations that they make. So the league does not support Amendment 2. We would like to keep the Constitution Revision Commission. There are some issues that have come up with the way the legislators put together some of the issues. In the past, they have bundled issues that were not similar. So maybe like talking about an education issue in the schools and then talking about the hospitals. And they would put it in one ballot issue question. So if you wanted one, you had to vote for the other. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But what we can do is just outlaw that, say single issue. And but rather than throw it in the trash, let's just fix it because we like the communication with citizens.
Thank you. One of the things that I did my homework, Attorney Schoon, and it says that the commission is 37 members. The state attorney general must serve on the commission. The rest of the members must be chosen by the governor, 15, House Speaker, 9, Senate President, 9, and the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court, 3. I'm only going to make a comment on it. You don't have to comment on it, but unless you'd like to. It seems that, and I'm glad to hear you because you clarified it, because when that they go around and talk to citizens, because depend upon who is controlling the state government. In this case, right now, it's Republicans. Things could sway and only be for things that are partisan specific. Obviously, that can go either way, Republican or Democrat. So I'm happy to hear that you say the commission actually goes around the state and talking to regular citizens, because the hope is that they are talking to a broad range of people, particular party affiliation, and even nonpartisan folks. So thank you for clearing that up. I appreciate that. Let's talk about Amendment 3. New $50,000 homestead exemption for certain public service employees. Now, first of all, for folks who may not understand, what is homestead exemption? And then talk about the amendment, please.
Okay. In the state of Florida, and every state has things that they want to encourage. And when a state wants to encourage something, the first thing they do is they'll give you an exemption, sort of like the tax holiday we get when it's time to buy clothing for the students and books and computers. Well, during that 2 or 3 weeks, the shops really make a lot of money, and the kids get taken care of. But that's something that the state puts in place because they know people want to save money from the taxes. Well, a homestead exemption works the exact same way. They say we want to encourage people to buy their homes. When you buy a home, you start investing. That's generational wealth that can be passed on to the next generation. It's one of the building blocks of our society. So the way the state encourages that, they say, we're not going to tax you at full value of your home. We're going to give you $25,000 exemption, which pretty much everybody gets if you have a home. Now, this is saying we want to give an extra bonus of, I believe it was $50,000 exemption to state employees who have certain kinds of jobs. firefighters, police officers, law enforcement, school teachers, because they are middle class people. They're not paid at the top of the rung, but they're working hard and they want to show respect. So that's what Amendment 3 is about. Now, the league's position on that, although we want to honor those groups of people and we think that they should be rewarded, we're concerned of one, the first concern I mentioned earlier of putting tax issues in the Constitution. And because this particular proposed exemption only is a benefit to a certain class of people, the league is against it because we don't like revenue issues in the Constitution. And this only benefits a small class of people versus Amendment 1 with protecting your home benefits the whole state. You know, because wherever you live, if you have by the river, by the bay, by the Gulf, if you have a flood or the waters come, everybody's going to get hurt. So that's kind of the analysis that we had. We do want that group of people to be protected and get benefits, but we think it would be better done with regular legislation.
And just to just give my own sidebar comment about the Amendment 3, whenever I hear people talk about public service employees, I retired from the Florida Department of Health, and there was never anything given to us extra for as first responders, right? And I also know that firefighters and police are typically employed by the county or city in which they reside. So for it to be given state privileges as a state employee then leans towards something that's really not true. But in fact, actual state employees like health department employees who were on the front line during COVID, testing people, giving vaccines, as they still are, for example, and a whole lot of, and those state employees who were making sure that food stamps were delivered or issued to people, they're never considered when all of these privileges happen. So I understand why you all will say that, you know, with Amendment 1 versus 3, everybody benefits from it. So only certain first responders are included in this particular amendment when there are a whole slate of other state employees who are actually not considered, but were on the front line. So that's my little sidebar to that, Attorney Schoon. Is there anything else? I know we only asked you to be with us a few minutes to explain the amendments. Is there anything about the ballot that you'd like to share with us other than that new ridiculous thing that talks about if someone comes up to vote and someone says, oh, she can't vote, she's a felon. And that they could then, you know, tell me I can't vote that day if that were me. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us as our folks prepare to go and vote?
Well, Ms. Turner, before we leave that particular subject and the voters' amendment, I would like to make sure that people understand that what we're looking at is, as you say, as Attorney Schoon stated, it is a preferential treatment. There are a lot of other people who can qualify for preferential treatment if you look at it from that standpoint. And trust me, I believe wholeheartedly that teachers are underpaid and a lot of our public servants are underpaid. But as she stated, there are other ways in which we can make amendments and help these diligent, hardworking people out without it becoming a permanent marker in our Constitution that we would then have to go get another amendment. If you can correct me if I'm mistaken, Ms. Schoon, go get another amendment to take it off. In addition, look at the money it may cost the local governments in terms of their revenue. And they would, truth be told, they don't have a real choice. And they're going to have to make that money up one way or the other. So, because I think in one of them, I saw where it was like $80-some million it would affect. local governments, and then the following year go up to 90-something million dollars. And where does it stop? And with the climate change, I mean, we need to start looking at where can we spend revenue to help people futuristically in terms of addressing climate change and the problems that are most certainly going to affect the state from that standpoint, especially our neighbors to the south. So I just wanted to throw my little 2 cents in on that one. And Ms. Schoon or Ms. Hobbs, either one of you guys, if you have any commentary on it, please feel welcome to do so.
And I'd also like to interject, Dr. Kane, before we move, to let our audience know if you have a question of either of our guests, particularly Attorney Schoon, before she steps away, our number is 888-669-1280. As you see posted on the screen, again, 888-669-1280. And thank you, Dr. Kane, for clarifying. We certainly respect our teachers, our firefighters, our police officers. Definitely meant no disrespect to them. Just want to make sure that we're fair when we're doling things out, that it includes everybody, that everybody gets a piece of the pie. And as Attorney Schoon said, that these things, and you, Dr. Kane, that it not become a part of our Constitution, because there are other things like climate change that we may need to redirect some funds to. And when people are already feeling taxed, if you will, then we have to make yet another constitutional amendment. Attorney Schoon, is there anything else you'd like to add?
She was speaking, but you're muted, Attorney Schoon. You're muted. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I probably did that so I wouldn't rustle papers. I wanted to share, you were talking about the whole thing with people with felony convictions. We refer to them as returning citizens after they finish their incarceration and probation. Well, we passed Amendment 4, as we all know, in 2018. The legislators came right back and put on something that was not intended, that people had to pay their fines and fees before they could vote. Now, because the records were not well maintained, they were never intended to block people from voting. They were always a local issue. And so now people are having difficulty getting the records to find out, did they pay everything? Is everything taken care of? So what the league has tried to do, because we want as many voters as possible, and we work with Desmond Meade and the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, the League of Women Voters of Florida, and many other groups, churches and all kinds, ACLU. We all worked hard to get this passed. So we're concerned that the full effect is not coming forward. So the league has created training for lawyers. It's free. Lawyers have to do continuing legal education. We have 2 courses which we give lawyers 4 credits. And then we ask the lawyers to donate pro bono time to help a returning citizen look at their records. And we give the training.
Oops.
Looks like, oh, is she coming back in? Oh, no.
Yeah, when she comes back, we want to make sure we do ask her the question. I agree with with Dr. Hall. Okay.
So
the number goes out for a second. If you can go back to the training part for the attorneys.
Yeah. So the phone number that they can call to get a free referral to a lawyer to look at their records, they don't have to guess whether they can vote or not. In other words, someone's going to look and help them. It's Can I Vote, CANI Vote at lwvfl.org. We have a dedicated email and a dedicated phone number. The phone number is 407-710-5496. So what we say is, and this information is also on our website, lwvfl.org. where the voter guide that Ms. Turner was looking at is there, the digital voter guide, and other information on returning citizens and other things that we want people to know about. There's also a number called vote411.org where people can look up their status of whether they're registered to vote. They can look and see what precincts they need to vote at. And people should check because things move around. Check and have a plan to vote. That's what our advice is. Look into it before the deadlines. And there are guidelines in the voter guide. There are guidelines on your supervisor of elections website. And there are guidelines on the league's website. So there's a lot of ways to get information. And I want to thank you for allowing me to speak. And I do have 2 more Zooms after this, and we're training some canvassers to do nonpartisan door knocking. So we're working with our local NAACP and others to make sure that, do all we can to let people know how important this vote is.
And Turner School, real quick, two quick things. Ms. Turner, I see.
Yes, sir.
One thing is, can you make sure you, before you leave or somewhere in the process, put those numbers into the private chat that you have? And the other thing is that, are you able to speak quickly on the on retaining or not retaining the judges? Any rule of thumb? Any rule of thumb, or what is the opinion of the League of Women Voters as it relates to those retention?
We do address that in our voter guide. And there is guidance that the Florida Bar does a survey to the lawyers and asks the lawyers which people should be retained. So you can look and see if you have a high number from the lawyers, that's a good sign. You can go directly to the Florida Bar and look at retention merit. If you see the number is dipping, then that is telling you that lawyers who work with these people have issues. So that's what the Florida Bar, the League of Women Voters, is saying. Those that know best are people that work with these people. The other thing we want to share is that pay attention to the lawyers and the Supreme Court justices that are not protecting the African American vote. Look at that case and you'll see these people said, that it was okay for Governor DeSantis to cut, and the legislators to cut the African American districts from 4 to 2, when that clearly is illegal under our fair districts. So you can kind of see who is going to follow the law and protect the rights of all. So there are indicators if people do a little bit of research, so that maybe that's something you can put out. This is how the judges voted on this particular case. That's a pivotal case that impacts us all. And the other is the Florida Bar survey.
Thank you, Attorney Schoon. And before you scoot away and we start our conversation with Dr. Hobbs, I want to make sure I captured what you said. You can go online to Can I Vote at lwvfl.org or
Yes.
vote411.org. And if you're not technologically savvy, you can dial 407-710-5496. Is that correct?
You are excellent. And I tried to put the phone number and the Can I Vote that you read out perfectly in the chat. And the dedicated email address and the dedicated phone number are in particular for persons who have felony convictions and want to get information on whether they can vote. But the other things have voting information in general for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Schoon. Dr. Hobbs, thank you so much for your patience. And I tell you what,
and Attorney Schoon, we do want to get you back at some future date, so you will be hearing from us again.
I think she's gone. She's frozen.
Okay.
Dr. Hobbs, you were so wonderful the other day. I tell you what, I have friends who pay attention to history and they share their nuggets about Florida history and the history and evolution of voting. So I think the thing that people don't remember that I always like to remind people is, as a woman, we haven't had the right to vote forever, right?
Correct.
So there was an amendment that gave us the right to vote. Tell us why, first of all, why why are you so interested in this topic, the evolution of
So,
voting? Because you seem so passionate about it.
yes, I think that and it's interesting because in the last several years I've been moving into the space of social justice and advocacy, and it really is rooted in my understanding of Black history. You can't study the history of slavery and abolition, the Civil War, Reconstruction, civil rights movement, and lynching, which is my area of expertise, and not come to appreciate kind of the intersections and the systems in which we operate. And once you understand that, it's very easy to get motivated to try to apply that knowledge to our current systems, because a lot of things change. Our economy changes, technology changes, but the basic systems of our government, as outlined by the United States Constitution, are pretty much the same. And so I have a deep interest, especially in civic engagement. I've founded the Florida Memorial University Social Justice Institute and have served as the inaugural executive director of the A. Philip Randolph Institute for Law, Race, Social Justice, and Economic Policy at Edward Waters University. But no matter what I uplift, whether it's health justice, economic justice, or criminal justice, the list goes on and on. Nothing is going to change unless we deal with voting rights and civic engagement. I love to quote Ibram Kendi, who is really a bit of the poster boy for anti-racist education. And he reminds us constantly that racism is not hurt feelings. Racism is policy. And the only way to change policy in the United States is through the legislative process. So it is at the root of the systemic changes we need to be about.
So is there a correlation? And I know this might seem a minute way of saying it, so forgive me because I'm not a historian. But is there a correlation between what some folk feel are suppressing our right to vote and racism or the history of voting or not
Absolutely.
being able to vote?
Absolutely, and that was really the genesis of the presentation that you saw, and it was really motivated by my work with young college students, and really trying to help crystallize for them the importance. And a lot of folks, we get history in bits and pieces, but to really follow that through line of this pattern of disenfranchisement of Black voters. There's a very good book that I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in this topic called Give Us the Ballot by Ari Berman. And what he says in the introduction to that book is that the United States is the only modern democracy that has ever enfranchised, disenfranchised, and re-enfranchised a group of people. And when you think about that, it's quite phenomenal. Now, we want to get quite specific. The group of people that he's referring to are Black Americans. And we can trace this history back to our emancipation back over 150 years ago after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is what gave Black men in 1870 the right not only to vote, but to participate in government. And if when you look at what happens then, and this is what I shared in the presentation, I love that period of history because not only do you have the jubilation of finally being liberated from slavery, slavery is all you've known, slavery is all your mother's known, slavery is all your grandparents have known. But the moment has finally come where the chains are broken and you're free, and now you get to participate in government. And not a lot of people know that when it comes to governmental participation during this time, Black men are going to participate at nearly every level. We send them to Washington, D.C. We even have a Black man who serves as governor of Louisiana during this period. Here in the state of Florida, we have someone like Jonathan Gibbs, who serves as Secretary of State back in the 1870s. He also goes on to become the superintendent of public instruction, one of the very first ones. That kind of leads to a tangent about the role that African Americans played in creating the public school system here in Florida and in other southern states. It was something that was a very high demand for those Black voters. But I'll tell you the story of Jonathan Walls. Jonathan Walls was born enslaved. He ended up finding his freedom during the war, served with the U.S. colored troops. He comes to Florida, ends up buying a farm outside of Alachua County. At one point had served as mayor of that county. But he becomes an African-American who the state of Florida sends to Washington, D.C. as a member of the House of Representatives. He serves between 1871 and 1877. But during that time period, you're going to have what we call white redemption, where white people first and foremost use violence, intimidation, and then they're able to gain control of the state constitutional process. And they begin to build into the Constitution things like felon disenfranchisement, poll taxes, literacy clauses, the list goes on. And they're able to effectively erode Black voting power here in the state of Florida. And when Josiah Walls leaves Washington, D.C. in 1877, we do not have another African-American in Congress from Florida for another 115 years. It's not until Carrie Meek is elected in 1992 that you see any more Black representation, congressional representation by African Americans in that body. And so I love uplifting that number because it helps to illustrate the fact that this has happened before. And when you have something like what we see taking place this last legislative session, where you have the governor specifically attacking Black congressional districts here in Duval County and in Central Florida, effectively, potentially cutting the Black vote here in the state by half, it reminds me of this gap, this 115-year gap between Josiah Walls and Carrie Meek. And those are the types of things through the study of history I want to remind people of, because I know this stuff, I have a real sense of urgency. It is frightening to me, the things that I'm seeing playing out in front of me.
You're muted, Dr. Kane.
All right. I don't have that knowledge that you have, which is, I'm so happy you're here to give us this knowledge. But I have the same sense of urgency and fear that you possess, because I see the writing on the wall. Because I'm old enough to remember what happened to my parents and my grandparents, but I'm also young enough to see my kids' generation not really being astute as my generation was, in terms of things that have happened to us in the past. And that if you don't know your past, you've heard that old adage about what holds in your future. So I feel it's critical that our young generation find out why and realize why we're so adamant about going out and exercising your right to vote, and why we may not agree. And I'm trying not to be partisan sometimes, but sometimes I just can't help it, because there are certain parties that are just evil, that are doing things that are not necessarily in Black folks' best interest, okay, or Americans' best interest, because it ain't just Black folks, but by the same token, even though I said that, it ain't just Black folks. What affects us can affect America in the long run as a whole. Will affect it as a whole.
Well, I think of Dr. Hobbs, and you can speak of, because we have a lot of ladies listening to our podcast. So when we talk, to see Roe versus Wade being overturned, for example, I then, as a woman, became threatened when women were given what amendment gave women, since you quoted the Black men and when they were able to vote, what amendment gave women, Black women, or women in general, rather, the right to vote?
Explicitly is going to be the 19th Amendment, which is passed in 1919 and ratified in 1920. That's when Black women are first able to cast their right to vote. It's a very interesting history on Black women and their civic participation, because even though they couldn't vote after 1870, there's a lot of documentation that they had an outsized influence on making sure that their men made it to the polls. And that's
49 years, though, 49 years from 1870 to 1919. 49 years. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but I think I added that right. 49 years.
Yes, you have to.
Wow.
I mean, you have to understand the position of women in our society, right? The men that wrote the Constitution and put it in place in 1787, didn't consider Indigenous people to be a part of the civic body. They didn't consider Black people at all. They definitely didn't consider women. And but it's just been over these years, and there is a really interesting intersection between the fight for women's right to vote and the fight for Black people's right to vote. Those movements kind of come one and the same. It was the women who were participating in the abolitionist movement during the antebellum years before the Civil War who recognized and advocating for enslaved Black people that they would be deprived of their liberty as well. And so you're going to see the seeds of the women's suffrage movement be planted in the abolitionist movement. So these rights movements do continue to track side by side and simultaneously. Frederick Douglass was a very early feminist. He supported women's rights to vote. He thought that that was a good and decent thing to do, but it made him an anomaly among men in the United States at that point in time. And so that's one thing that I think is a really beautiful lesson from our past, is that we have to continue to create that more perfect union. And each generation has a charge to take a look at their society and determine, what needs to be fixed, who needs to be brought in. And I love that quote from Nicole Hannah Jones. She's been made controversial unnecessarily, but she is the editor of that 1619 Project that was first published in the New York Times and later in its own book. But she points to the fact that it has been people of African descent in this country that have been the perfecters of our union. It has been our struggle for inclusion in a society that has really helped to shape and advance this democracy. And that is, undeniable. I don't know why some people seem to get upset about that, but the history does review that as track. So for me, Ms. Turner, I pace that change along with all the other changes that we've seen. And it's also a misnomer. I think back, that would have been 2020, when we were observing the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. There was a lot being made on social media about Black women. This has not been a celebration for Black women because Black women didn't have the right to vote. That's absolutely not true. While there was racism, and while Black women, just like Black men, had to contend with all of those voter suppression laws that I described to you of that period, whether it be poll taxes or literacy tests, do know that Black women were incredibly enthusiastic about their right to vote in 1920. I shared on Sunday the story of Mary McLeod Bethune. She is such an incredible leader, but she too raised her voice and used her energy to not only advocate for women's right to vote, but as the story goes, she got on her bicycle and was riding through the neighborhoods in Daytona Beach, encouraging Black women to vote now that they could, encouraging Black people, as she said, to do like her. And maybe you don't have butter for your bread, but make sure you have that dollar to go and pay your poll tax. And it was through her efforts that she was able to get a tremendous number of women to register to vote here in Duval County. We know that about 4,000 Black women registered to vote in 1920. They were prepared and ready to take action. But they too faced special discrimination. It was in that year because the Klan and the forces of white supremacy were concerned about what adding Black women to the voting rolls would do, that they began a statewide terroristic campaign running from Jacksonville to Miami throughout the state. They even showed up at the Daytona Institute and tried to intimidate Mary McLeod Bethune. But she was absolutely fearless in her work. And so there is a tremendous story to be told about our foremothers and their right to vote. And I don't separate it from what we see today. Black women show up at the polls at incredible numbers. We are highly motivated voters. We show up, we lead. I think it was Anna Julia Cooper who said that when and where Black women enter, the whole race comes with us. That has been our truth for many, many years now, and continues to be true when we talk about voting rights. I want to address the question in the chat. People want to know about that 115-year gap again. You're going to be looking for the names of Josiah Walls, who went to the U.S. House of Representatives originally in 1871, left in 1877. And we wouldn't see another Black representative from Florida until Carrie Meek is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1992. That's where that 115-year gap comes from.
Dr. Hobbs, thank you for refreshing the audience's memory of that. But let's talk about the 14th Amendment, because that was the other one that you talked about that really is symbolic, if you will, of what's happening today.
Absolutely.
Remind people of that, because I know we don't remember all of this stuff.
Sure. When I try to do a lot of this as a public historian, give people tidbits that they can hang on to. And when you think about what is happening for Black people after they're emancipated and what's going to pave their way to ensure our democracy, you have to remember the 13th Amendment, 1865, that ended slavery. You have to know the 14th Amendment, which made Black people citizens, that was ratified in 1868, and then the 15th that we just talked about in 1870. But out of all of those, I have argued, and many scholars agree, that the 14th Amendment has had the most impact on our nation and our continued struggle for civil rights. The 14th Amendment was necessary because in all the things that they did pretty well, when we talk about the so-called founding fathers, of course, they're not without criticism, because that document does indeed protect and provide for the extension of slavery, which is, of course, a point for us. But they did not define in that document what made a person a citizen. And as a result, standing law, by the time we get to emancipation, rested in the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott versus Sanford, which was decided by that body in 1859, in which Justice Taney, writing for the majority, said that Black people had no rights that any white man was bound to respect, that we were never intended to be citizens, had no rights as citizens, and as such, even, couldn't even come before the court. So that court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1859, was standing law in the United States up until the time that the 14th Amendment was passed. The 14th Amendment was really all about trying to take these 4 million newly emancipated people of African descent that had just been liberated and bringing them into the American Body Republic. It's going to be the 14th Amendment that does that, in that it defines citizenship. I also spoke about the second part of the 14th Amendment. One part defines citizenship, but then the second part says, as a citizen, that you are entitled to due process under law, and your civil rights cannot be violated. And that's the piece of the 14th Amendment that we've come back to time and time again. When it was the part that was used in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was ultimately unsuccessful. It was used again in Brown versus Board of Education. When you look time and time again, anytime people are making advocating for cases for the protection of civil rights, they're coming back to the 14th Amendment. So it's a really, really important update to the Constitution that came about in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War.
You mentioned, and I was taking notes, by the way, she was so great. You can tell, Dr. Hobbs, you didn't know, but I was putting it on my phone. What is the Compromise of 1877? I wrote that down, but I didn't write what it meant.
Sure. So 1877 is a really important year. It's the same year, if you remember, that I said that Josiah Walls left the U.S. Congress after his term expired. But part of what led to that is a conspiracy that we call the Compromise of 1877. It was a result of a contested presidential election that took place the previous year in 1876. There was a Democrat, Samuel Tilden, who ran against a Republican, Rutherford Hayes. And because of political fighting and violence during the election, as there was nearly every time there was an election in the South, with white people trying to fight against Black people to intimidate and scare them and beat them sometimes away from the polls, there were irregular returns in states like Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And because there was no clear winner, it took months of wrangling to try to figure out who was going to be the president, kind of the shades of 2000 for those of us who lived through that controversy. Well, eventually, there was a backroom deal that was struck in the spring of 1877. The Democrats, who at that point were the majority of the South, the Republicans was the party that had protected Black rights, had emancipated Black people, and the party that Black people voted with. Many of these early elected officials are going to be members of the Republican Party. We can talk about when that shifts in our history. But the Democrats said to the Republican, hey, we'll let Rutherford Hayes take the White House. But once he's in there, what we want him to do is to remove federal troops from throughout the South. And that was really important because the only thing that was really preventing Black people and Black leaders from being completely decimated in the region was the continued presence of these federal troops. And so the Democrats were willing to trade the White House and control in Washington, D.C. in exchange for what we call home rule. They wanted a return to white supremacy, to be able to kind of move forward with this reign of terroristic violence throughout the South without being accountable to these federal troops that had been protecting Black life. And so in a nutshell, that is the Compromise of 1877. For us historians, we refer to that, in the words of Rayford Logan, a famous historian from Howard University, as the beginning of the nadir in Black history. It was a low point. We'll see the erasure of Black leadership throughout the South. All of these thousands of Black men who had served at city, county, state government are going to be run out of office. You're going to see lynching violence come to fruition over the next 90 years. Some 5,000 people are going to be executed without any kind of legal investigation or people being brought to justice. It's going to take what we sometimes call a second reconstruction in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s for us to really kind of get this correct. And it's my generation that has really benefited from those changes that came not in the 1860s when we originally got them, but the second time around in the 1960s. So it's a very interesting history there when you think about kind of this path towards Black people really being able to exercise their rights as citizens and participate in this government.
And that was 5,000 people we knew of.
Correct, yes.
Dr. Hobbs, of all the things that have been happening lately, I mean, you know, and it saddens me to hear this parallel in history, what's going on today, even as you spoke of the Compromise of 1877. And by the way, let me give my one little plug. If you have a question of Dr. Hobbs, you can dial in at 888-669-1280. Again, 888-669-1280. I don't know. I'm just so, of all the things that have happened in history of the different amendments, which one do you think is, and if this is inappropriate, just by all means, skip the subject and move to something else. Which one of the amendments do you think are the most threatened by people, and that is why all of these different laws are happening now to try to change it? Is it the 13th or the 14th or the 15th or the 19th even that people don't want to see happening? My guess would be the one in 18th, what that gave Black men the right to vote, but that's just my guess.
Yeah. For me, it is not necessarily about any single piece of legislation, although there are many here in the state of Florida that I'm greatly concerned about. I have been concerned as a historian, especially someone who studies racial violence and racial climate. I have been concerned about the surge of white supremacy that we are seeing throughout our nation. And I have been since 2015. I heard during the presidential campaign, 2015, 2016, things that I had never heard before. I had only read about by that were said and written by racist politicians in the 1900s and 19 teens. And that began to ring an alarm bell for me, because part of our trajectory that we've been on in this society, kind of since the 1960s, I used 1968 as a line of demarcation after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. We made an agreement that being openly racist and expressing those ideas was something that was abhorrent. It was something that was not allowed to happen in public. That began to change in 2015 and 2016. And it's greatly concerning to me, because giving voice to racism encourages further racist thought. Racist thought extends to racist action, and many racist action ultimately result in violence against people of color, most especially Black people. But as we've seen during the years of the pandemic, our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters were attacked violently because of the accusations that were falsely made against them, blaming them for the coronavirus pandemic. And we've seen, these really dangerous increases in violence. And as someone who's written about and studied lynching history, it really is frightening to me. And you couple that with police brutality, which we really haven't quite gotten into check. And then we have January 6th and what we see there, and what I see in the outcomes of this election and the next presidential election. It will absolutely be a tipping point in our democracy, whether or not we will have rule of law, due process, peaceful transfer of power, and adherence to the law, or are we going to give in to these forces of white supremacy that come in many different forms. They're using the toolbook that I referenced from the 1870s and 1880s without not a whole lot of creativity or edits. But I hope that people take this seriously. I hope people understand, particularly people of color, while we are still a minority in this country. We do have a role to play in these elections and tipping the scales in a way that is going to be most conducive for our survival and our ability to thrive in this country and in this economy. So to answer your question, it's not any particular piece of legislation. It is the surge of white supremacy and white nationalism that is undeniable, that we don't talk enough about, that has frankly infiltrated a particular political party, is undeniable. And that's the real threat, in my opinion, to what we're seeing here.
Thank you. Dr. Hobbs, you wrote a book. Tell us about that book. Or have you written more than one? I bought the other day.
one book of history. The others are children's books that I won't bore you with. But my history book was published by the University Press of Florida in 2015. The title is Democracy Abroad: Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. Really proud to report that it won a Florida Book Award, as well as the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Award from the Florida Historical Society. But I'm most proud of the work that I was able to do to document the story of 4 lynchings that took place here in the state of Florida between 1941 and 1945. One of them took place in my hometown of Live Oak, Florida, in Suwannee County. And that story was one that I found out about as a student at Florida A&M University. It was there that I began to learn for the very first time the depth and breadth of African American history. And I had one professor who knew where I was from, who said to me, "I bet you don't know that they lynched a boy in Live Oak." And I was incredulous and didn't believe it. How could I have grown up in this community and not have heard of something so terrible? And sure enough, I went home my next visit and asked my grandfather about it. And, he told me the story of Willie James Howard. It was a young man about his age who in 19 44, was accused of passing a note to a white girl with whom he worked. And that girl's father, Philip Goff, who was a former Florida state senator, went to his home with two other white men, kidnapped his mother at gunpoint, put him in the car, drove to his father's place of work, kidnapped his father at gunpoint. And then that party of five drove out to the banks of the Swanee River, where Willie James Howard's hands and feet were tied. And in front of his father, he was given the choice of being shot or jumping to his death in the Swanee River. And he chose the latter. And it's a terrible story, incredibly heart-wrenching. But what people don't recognize is that took place 11 years before the murder of Emmett Till, the lynching of Emmett Till. And of course, now people are going to the theaters to watch the film about that tragedy. But here in Florida, we have a parallel tragedy that took place many years before. And I am really grateful to be able to have documented that lynching through not only the court records and other records, but oral history from people who remembered him and the other four lynching victims that I write about in Jackson County, Gaston County, Swanee County, and Madison County during those years. Ironically, and that's kind of where the title comes from, at the same time that the United States is fighting a war for democracy against the Axis powers and Adolf Hitler in Europe, what you see constantly was with the Black press and Black journalists is them uplifting the high irony that this country that claimed to be democratic and seemed very interested in protecting the lives of others overseas still had not yet taken the steps to protect Black life here on these shores. And so that is, in a nutshell, what is in that book.
Thank you. And we're going to post that again so that our audience can get the book, because I do have it. And also, someone asked about the Voting Rights Act. Can you speak about that?
Yes. So I talked about this a little bit in the presentation, because when you track when things began to change, of course, after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was when it was originally passed, it's going to usher in a whole new era of Black elected representatives. It's because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we have Carrie Meek eventually being elected. But things began to change after Barack Obama is elected not once, but twice to the presidency of the United States. He's elected for the second time in 2012. And the very next year, in 2013, we have a challenge from one of the counties that had been identified for pre-clearance as a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Because of these certain areas, because of previous misbehavior, before they made any changes to their voting laws, had to get special permission, I believe, from the Department of Justice to change that. Well, Shelby County, Alabama sued the Attorney General and Eric Holder for the removal of that pre-clearance, that it was antiquated, problems had been solved, we got a Black president, my goodness, everything is right in the world. And because of the shifts in the U.S. Supreme Court to swing towards the more conservative justices, they were able to come out of that victorious. There's a quote from Justice Scalia who said that, the continued use of the pre-clearance was, an expectation of continued entitlement and continued racial entitlement by one group in the United States. So Shelby versus Holder, that U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2013, is going to strike out that particular section, Section 4, which set the formula for Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act. And in that same year, you are going to see in 49 states, 395 new laws proposed in state legislatures that are doing everything from requiring voter ID. They're attacking souls to the polls, vote by mail. And we've just seen a continuance of that up until in 2021 with Senate Bill 90 here in the state of Florida. It was Ms. Schoon and the League of Women Voters, along with other plaintiffs, that filed suit here in the state of Florida to prevent some of the worst elements of that bill from taking place. And the judge, actually been appointed by a Republican, Judge Mark Walker, actually agreed with those plaintiffs and pulled back some of those ridiculous provisions that were a part of that legislative item. And so there's no accident that these things continue to happen. If we study Black history, and we all need to, because these are patterns, and racism is real. Racism is people don't like to talk about it, but it is very much mixed up in the DNA of this country. It's something that we have worked very hard to move past. There's been an incredible amount of progress made, but there's always the potential, if we are not vigilant, for things to move in the right direction. And I'm here to tell anybody who's listening or watching, as someone who studied this, it is moving in the wrong direction. And you don't want to wake up in a position where the things have already been put in place, and it's going to take too much time for you to undo them. The time to act is every time that you can cast your ballot. You have to educate yourself, because there's just so much that comes along as a part of that. We talk about the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, and I've shared with you all of these court decisions, from Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, Shelby versus Holder, the list goes on and on. The people that we have sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court interpret the laws of this land and can shift things in one direction or the other. And while we may be unfocused, there are other groups of people that are incredibly focused. And since Obama has been elected, have set their sights on state legislatures and have been very effective, have set their sights on the U.S. Supreme Court and have been very effective, as we can see with the Dobbs decision. They've set their sights on the judiciary and have been very successful. As a matter of fact, there have been so many of those positions that have been filled with conservative judges that people are predicting that it's going to take a couple of generations for us to be able to outlive that, because those are lifetime appointments. So somebody at the table is playing chess, and some others are playing checkers, or just not even showing up to the game. I hear some really ridiculous stuff. Our system is not perfect, but is the one we have. When the table gets set, you have a choice to make. Not making a choice also subjects you to the outcomes that other people would like. And so we've got to, my hope is that we'll develop a continual culture of civic education in our community, so we can stay prepared, so we can develop a bench of people who are prepared to run and lead ethically and progressively, to make sure that the wealth that this country generates is shared by more folks.
I attended the inaugural civil rights conference here in Jacksonville a couple of months ago, and I remember the younger folks were saying, and I'm talking 20s and 30 something, they said they never heard of that part of Black history in high school, middle school, college. And someone posted a question: where do you learn about Black history if it is not taught in school?
Sure. And I gave my big answer to your question about white supremacy. If there's anything that's really got my hackles up this year, has been HB 7 and the Stop Woke Act, because if you go deep with this thing and really understand that, I have another presentation that I've done to really dive into this question. You have to go back to the success of the 1619 Project. That is the genesis of so much of this. The fact that you have scholars who are, in actuality, taking a provision of critical race theory, in that centering the experiences of marginalized people and telling the story through their lens. That's all they did in 1619, and told a factual history that it was so abhorrent to the sensibilities of people who had only been spoon-fed this really polished, untrue mythological history of the United States of America, that, they've been kicking ever since. And, some kicks matter more than others. When people have power, want to silence you, they can do so. And so in many legislatures throughout this country, Nicole Hannah-Jones, in her book, The 1619 Project, along with Ibram Kendi and his work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Robin DiAngelo and others, have been absolutely vilified, because people draw a direct connection between the 1619 Project, which was published in 2019 on the 400th anniversary of the first time on record that we have Black people coming to the shores of this country to what we see in the streets of 2020. And that is those demonstrations and protests against police brutality and murder after the cases of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. And if you look at those crowds, first of all, they were historic in number. There were more people in the streets, more demonstrations than we saw in the 1960s. Every state in this country and internationally saw protests. And over 50% of those crowds were not Black people. These were young people. It was a multiracial alliance standing and demanding justice. And there were many people across this country who looked at that and were absolutely upset. And they draw a line between the teachings of things like 1619, the whole push towards diversity, equity, and inclusion training, as why those folks who represent a sizable majority in this country were so much in favor of equality and inclusion. And they have been doing everything that they can to silence that, to squash that. And it's a really incredibly dangerous trend. I know the way that law is written, because it's written not about fact, but about emotion. If you hurt somebody's feelings, a white person's feelings, and talking about the fact of our history, and there's a lot to feel bad about, you can somehow become the subject of a lawsuit. It's absolutely outrageous. And so it's a lot. It's something that we have to contend with, right? Using the system. You don't return legislators who voted for something like that back to the state legislature. You don't send people to Washington, D.C. who to support views like that. But the other side of our history is that while we've had to contend with these racist systems in the past, we know that the antidote is our own power and our own agency. And I've had the privilege of being a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for a number of years. I served as the president of the South Florida chapter. That was the roots of that organization back in the 1920s when Carter G. Woodson started Negro History Week. His goal was to make sure that Black children had a curriculum, had the knowledge to inoculate their minds against the evil forces of white supremacy. And he knew that the best venue for that was in our Black churches, Black institutions, teaching Black history to Black children. No one can get in the way of that. And we have many, many outlets, the church still, other schools still, our community groups that can take the charge and take the curriculum. There's so much resources out there to help make sure that our children still get that. So we have to be proactive, and we have to use our own power. We have to use our own institutions to do that work. But it's a strategy, because if we don't know our own history, we are not equipped to fight the way that we need to. If white people don't know Black history, they get caught up in all of these mythological lies about who this country is and who we are, and that continues to be problematic. So education is a key. Inclusive history is the key. Telling the stories of those who are marginalized and bringing them into the center is the key.
Dr. Hobbs, again, you've been wonderful. I know that our listeners have learned a lot from you tonight. We promised you and our audience that we end the show at 7:30. However, you were so captivating, we couldn't stop. And also, I can tell you from Dr. Kane's perspective that we're gonna want to have you back again. So don't not answer my phone when I dial your number. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. As we end all of our shows, we like to give our guests the opportunity to share their final thoughts. What are your final thoughts as we close tonight's discussion?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And I guess if I can say anything in this election season is that we have to get out there, take yourselves and everyone that you know who's a registered voter to the polls, and make sure that your voice is heard. Make sure that you educate yourself, and know that the system is imperfect, but you will get the government that you deserve. And if you're absent, that applies as well. So let's get in the game and work towards a better outcome for all of us. Our ancestors have paved the way for us to move forward.
Thank you. Dr. Kane, what are your final thoughts?
I know we've been going for a while, but again, Dr. Hobbs, I really appreciate you being on our show. I knew it would be rewarding. I warned you ahead of time that it was going to go longer than what we were slated for. So, and a couple of quick things. I am so happy for more than one reason. Definitely because of you've educated us and enlightened us on from a historical standpoint where we stood. You've also enlightened us where we stand, and you've also enlightened us where we need to go. Okay, so I really appreciate that. I really feel somewhat vindicated, and I think my co-host and my behind the scenes guy can tell you whole part of I put together this show. A lot of it was based on what things that you have said. In particular, we've discussed things like the 1619 projects. We've discussed things like why they're not educating us they don't want to educate us meaning our kids and family in schools and public schools. We've also spoke to in our past. We have spoke to when they start talking about taking our country back, and we've always said take it back to win, not to necessarily just to what, but to win, and that's when white supremacy reigned. And so I really, really appreciate your comments because it support my mission, my efforts, and what I've been doing, and I'm not giving up on it. None of us are giving up on it. None of my co-host and my behind the scenes guy. That's why we here at Pause for the Truth. If you realize what it stands for, we want the truth to come out, and so we can make some changes to the way things are the direction things are trying to go, and retain our democracy and our freedom. So thank you very much for being here. We have got to have you back without a doubt, where you're going to come on and the show is yours.
Again, Dr. Hobbs, thank you. But before we end the show, please tell us the name of your book again. The one, not the children's book, not that they're not important, but
Yes, it's Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. And you can find that and more information at my website, www.tamikabradleyhobbs.com. It's my website, and you can find links to purchase my book, all of them, and more information there. But thank you so much for the opportunity to uplift that. It's just, I'm grateful to be here and then to know that you all have been at this for some time.
Ms. Turner, I have to ask before she get off. I see the name Bradley. You're out of South Florida. I had friends and classmates at Dillard and so on with Bradley, and family members with Bradley. So I need to find out if there's some relationship there.
My father is Lawrence Bradley. He is a native of Madison County in North Florida. So
Okay.
The Bradleys and the Hudsons in Madison County, those are my roots.
I will check it out. Thank you, ma'am.
So tonight's conversation was a very important one as we learned about the evolution of voting. We started tonight's show talking about the amendments from Attorney Schoon with the League of Women Voters of Florida. A power-packed discussion tonight. Please make sure the link to tonight's show is going to be available on YouTube. Make sure that you share it. A lot of good information from our guests. We want to make sure that you are knowledgeable as you make the decision to go vote. Don't assume that your family and friends are going to vote. Your assumptions may not be correct. Help them find the information. Attorney Schoon talked about going on the Florida Bar's website and looking for retention merit, because when it comes to the judges, they're making decisions about our loved ones and friends who are showing up at the court. You want to know what other lawyers think about them. If other lawyers think they're crappy, right? And that they're not fair. I'll be politically correct, that they're not fair. And so you also want to make sure that you know whether or not, if you're a felon, that you are able to vote. You can go on Can I Vote at lwvfl.org. Again, that's Can I Vote at lwvfl.org. Or you can call 407-710-5496 And it's all going to be on our website at pauseforthetruth.com. And you can also access some information at vote411.org. All of the things that I've just said are very important. Again, pay attention, educate yourselves, a call and to say to churches and community-based organizations, find a historian like Dr. Hobbs, find that association of studies of life of African American. I just botched us.
Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. Hazel Gillis is the president of the Jacksonville branch, the James Weldon Johnson branch of that organization. They are probably one of the oldest in the state. So right here in Jacksonville, they are active and looking for more members.
And I remember that because I had some friends who are part of the organization. Another thing that Dr. Hobbs mentioned, how to be an anti-racist, and the 1619 Project. When you're trying to decide what Christmas presents to buy, you want to give Dr. Hobbs' book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the 1619 Project. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Hobbs. Good night.
Don't forget to vote next week. I mean, not next week, 2 weeks from now.
Now, early voting.
Early voting, but don't miss the deadline. I guess that's what I should have said.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night.